In the summer of 1981, the small river town of Ashford Hollow was the kind of place where doors stayed unlocked and neighbors knew every child by name. That illusion of safety shattered the morning 6-year-old Lily Harper vanished from her front yard. One moment she was drawing chalk flowers on the pavement, her laughter drifting through the air. The next, she was gone. No footprints, no screams, no witnesses, just silence. Her mother, Margaret Harper, searched until her voice broke and her feet bled. Volunteers scoured woods and riverbanks. Police questioned everyone. Weeks turned into months, months into years. Eventually, the case grew cold, and the town learned to speak Lily's name only in whispers. But Margaret never stopped waiting, never packed away Lily's clothes, never accepted the word closure. 30 years later, Margaret is living a quieter life, older, heavier with grief, but still holding on to memory like a lifeline. On the night of what would have been Lily's 36th birthday, Margaret opens an old box she hasn't touched in decades. Inside are photographs she's seen 1,000 times. Or so she thinks. Then she sees it. In the corner of a faded photograph, taken the same day Lily disappeared, is something Margaret had never noticed before. Something impossibly small. Something devastatingly familiar. A detail so wrong, so precise, it makes her hands begin to shake. Because it shouldn't be there. And yet it is. What follows is not relief, but terror. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The afternoon sun hung low over Ashford Hollow on June 17, 1981, casting long shadows across Riverside Street. Summer vacation had just begun, and the children of the neighborhood celebrated with the wild freedom only the first week of summer could bring. Bicycle wheels spun down driveways. Screen doors slammed in rhythmic succession. Lemonade stands appeared on corners like seasonal miracles, staffed by enterprising children who'd taped hand-drawn signs to their card tables. Margaret Harper stood at the kitchen sink, washing strawberries and watching her daughter through the window above the faucet. The window was open, letting in the warm breeze that carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and honeysuckle. She could hear the distant shouts of children playing, the rhythmic thwack of a baseball hitting a glove, the musical chime of an ice cream truck making its lazy rounds through the neighborhood. Lily knelt on the sidewalk just beyond their small front lawn, a cardboard box of colored chalk beside her, drawing what appeared to be a garden of impossible flowers. Pink roses taller than houses, their petals elaborate spirals of color. Purple tulips with smiling faces and eyelashes. A yellow sunflower wearing what looked like a crown made of stars. She was small for 6, with a wild mess of copper-red curls that refused to stay tied back, no matter how many times Margaret tried to tame them with ribbons and clips. Freckles scattered across her nose, and cheeks like constellations, darker in summer when the sun kissed her face. Her yellow sundress, the one Margaret had sewn herself with tiny white daisies stitched along the hem, was already smudged with chalk dust and rainbow streaks. Margaret smiled, her hands moving through the cool water, rubbing each strawberry clean. Her girl was an artist, a dreamer, the kind of child who believed flowers could talk and stars had names only she knew. Just last week, Lily had informed her parents with complete seriousness that the moon followed their car because it wanted to make sure they got home safely. "Mom," Lily called without looking up from her artwork, her voice bright and clear. "Can I use the blue for the sky, or should I save it for the ocean I'm going to draw tomorrow?" "Use whatever you want, sweetheart," Margaret called back, leaning closer to the window screen. "There's plenty more chalk in the garage if you run out." "Okay," Lily said, already selecting the blue stick and dragging it across the concrete in a wide arc. That was the last conversation they ever had. Margaret turned back to the sink, her attention shifting to the strawberries glistening red in the colander, to the pie crust waiting on the counter that still needed to be rolled out, to the ordinary rhythm of an ordinary day. She hummed softly to herself as she worked, an old folk song her own mother used to sing. The kitchen was warm, the sunlight streaming through the lace curtains her grandmother had made decades ago. She dried the strawberries carefully, arranging them on a clean towel, glanced at the recipe card propped against the sugar canister, even though she'd made this pie 100 times and knew the measurements by heart. Moved to the counter and began working the rolling pin across the dough, flour dusting her hands. When she looked up again, perhaps 3 minutes later, no more than 5, the sidewalk was empty. The chalk was still there, a portrait of abandonment. The box lay on its side, colors scattered across the concrete like confetti. The blue stick Lily had just been using lay at the edge of an unfinished sky, a streak of azure trailing off into nothing. But Lily was gone. Margaret set down the rolling pin, wiping her hands on her apron as she moved toward the front door. A small flutter of concern stirred in her chest, but she pushed it down. Lily was probably just around the corner, she told herself. Maybe she'd gone to see Mrs. Brennan's new kittens next door. Maybe Tommy Chan from across the street had called her over to see his new bike. She stepped out onto the front porch, shielding her eyes against the bright afternoon sun. Lily. No answer came back. Just the distant hum of a lawnmower, the lazy buzz of cicadas in the trees, the faint bark of a dog somewhere down the street. The street stretched quiet in both directions, lined with modest houses and well-kept lawns. A sprinkler hissed and rotated 2 houses down, creating small rainbows in its spray. Mrs. Patterson's wind chimes sang their metallic song from her porch. Everything looked normal, peaceful, safe. But no little girl in a yellow sundress. Margaret's heartbeat quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. Children wandered. It was what they did. She walked to the edge of the yard, her sandals crunching on the gravel driveway, then to the neighbor's hedge where Lily sometimes liked to hide and jump out to surprise her. Lily, this isn't funny, baby. Come out right now. Still nothing. She walked faster now, circling around to the backyard, checking the swing set, the sandbox, the little playhouse David had built last summer. All empty. She moved through the side yard, past the garbage cans, checked the garage even though the door was closed. Nothing. Panic began to creep in like cold water rising, slow at first, then faster. Margaret broke into a run, moving from yard to yard, her voice growing louder, more desperate. Lily Harper, where are you? This isn't a game. You need to come here right now. Doors began to open. Neighbors appeared on porches, their faces shifting from curiosity to concern as they registered the fear in Margaret's voice. Mrs. Brennan came down her porch steps, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Margaret? What's wrong? Have you seen Lily? Margaret asked breathlessly, her voice already cracking. She was right there, just drawing on the sidewalk. I only looked away for a minute. Mrs. Brennan's face went pale. No, honey, I haven't seen her since this morning when she was riding her bike. Tommy Chin's mother rushed out, car keys in hand. I'll drive around the block. Sometimes kids wander further than they realize. Within 15 minutes, a dozen adults were searching. Mr. Patterson checked his backyard and shed. The Kowalski family split up, taking different streets. Mrs. Chan drove slowly through the neighborhood, her head swiveling back and forth, calling Lily's name out her car window. Within an hour, the police arrived. Margaret stood in her front yard, surrounded by concerned neighbors, as 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb. Her hand shook. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. David wasn't home yet, still at his shift at the paper mill on the other side of town, and she'd already called him 3 times, leaving increasingly frantic messages. Officer Jake Riley emerged from the first car, his face serious but calm. He was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes that tried to project confidence. Mrs. Harper? I'm Officer Riley. Can you tell me exactly what happened? Margaret's words tumbled out in a rush, barely coherent. The chalk, the strawberries, the 3 minutes, the empty sidewalk. As she spoke, she kept looking past him, scanning the street, desperate to see that flash of yellow, those copper curls. "We'll find her," Officer Riley said, his hand gentle on her shoulder. Kids this age, they usually don't go far. Probably just lost track of time playing somewhere. But even as he said it, Margaret could see the shadow of doubt in his eyes. By evening, the scale of the search had expanded exponentially. Bloodhounds arrived, their handlers letting them smell Lily's pillowcase, her favorite stuffed rabbit, her dirty clothes from the hamper. The dogs strained at their leashes, noses pressed to the ground, but the trail ended at the curb. Just stopped, as though Lily had been plucked from the earth itself. David arrived home to find his front yard transformed into a command center. Squad cars lined both sides of the street, their radios crackling with updates. Volunteers gathered in clusters, being organized into search teams. Flashlights were distributed as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. His face went white as Margaret collapsed into his arms in the middle of the yard, her whole body shaking with sobs she could no longer control. She was right there. Margaret kept repeating, her words muffled against his chest. "She was right there, David. I only looked away for a second. Just a second." David held her, his own eyes filling with tears as the reality crashed over him. His little girl, his baby, gone. The search continued through the night. Flashlights swept through the woods behind the neighborhood, their beams cutting through the darkness like desperate prayers. Volunteers called Lily's name until their voices went hoarse. Divers were brought in to check the river that ran along the edge of town, though everyone prayed it wouldn't come to that. Every basement within a 2-mile radius was searched. Every shed, every garage, every abandoned building. The old Johnson farmhouse that had sat empty for 3 years was combed from top to bottom. The drainage tunnels under the highway were explored, officers wading through dark water with waterproof flashlights. But there was nothing, no trace, no clue, no sign that Lily Harper had ever existed beyond that chalk drawing on the sidewalk, that portrait of impossible flowers already fading in the summer heat. Margaret didn't sleep. She couldn't. She stood at the front window all night, watching the flashlights move through the darkness, watching the searchers come and go, praying with every fiber of her being that one of them would emerge from the woods carrying her daughter. When dawn finally came, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed obscene in their beauty, Lily was still missing. The investigation consumed Ashford Hollow in the days and weeks that followed. What had been a quiet river town became the center of a media storm. News vans park along Riverside Street, their satellite dishes raised like accusing fingers toward the sky. Reporters descended from Pittsburgh, from Philadelphia, from as far away as New York City, all chasing the same tragic story. A little girl vanished in broad daylight from her own front yard. Margaret and David's faces were plastered across every newspaper, every television screen. Missing child posters went up on every telephone pole, in every shop window, at every rest stop along the interstate. Lily's school photo, the one from just 2 months ago, where she'd worn her favorite purple sweater and smiled with that gap-toothed grin, became the image everyone recognized. The tip line rang constantly. Hundreds of calls poured in from across the state, across the country, each one a flicker of hope that died as quickly as it ignited. A woman in Pittsburgh called to say she'd seen a girl matching Lily's description at the Greyhound station, holding hands with a man in a baseball cap. Police rushed to investigate. The girl turned out to be someone else's daughter, safe and accounted for. A truck driver reported seeing a child's yellow dress abandoned on the shoulder of Route 28, about 40 miles from Ashford Hollow. Officers scoured the area for hours. The dress was 2 sizes too big, belonged to a teenager whose family had thrown away. A psychic from Ohio contacted the police, claiming she'd had a vision of Lily near water, alive but frightened, hidden in a place with red walls. Detective Morrison, who'd taken lead on the case, followed up dutifully despite his skepticism. They searched every building with red walls within 50 miles. Found nothing. Suspicion spread through the town like poison, seeping into relationships that had seemed unshakable. Neighbors who'd shared casseroles and Christmas cookies for years now eyed each other with distrust. Every man became a potential suspect. Every unexplained absence a cause for investigation. The mailman, Roger Hendricks, who delivered mail on Riverside Street for 15 years, found himself questioned for 6 hours because someone remembered he'd been on the street that afternoon. His alibi held. He'd been witnessed by dozens of people on his route, but the suspicion lingered in whispered conversations. The school janitor, Martin Webb, was brought in because a parent remembered he'd once given Lily a lollipop. His entire life was dissected, turned inside out. He was cleared, but the damage was done. He quit his job a month later and moved away. Even David Harper faced scrutiny, his every movement during that day examined with microscopic intensity. Where had he been? Who had seen him? Could anyone confirm his timeline? Detective Morrison, a 30-year veteran with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen too much, approached the questioning with the grim determination of a man who knew that in most cases, the answer hid within the family. Statistics didn't lie. When children disappeared, someone close was almost always responsible. But David had been at work, his time card stamped, his presence confirmed by a dozen co-workers. He'd been in the break room eating lunch when Lily vanished, surrounded by witnesses who remembered him being there. And Margaret had been home, visible to 3 different neighbors throughout the afternoon. Mrs. Brennan had waved to her through the kitchen window around 1:30. Mr. Patterson had borrowed a ladder from David's garage at 2 o'clock and chatted with Margaret for 5 minutes. Mrs. Chun had called the house at 2:40 to ask about a church bake sale, and Margaret had answered, her voice normal, unstressed. There was no window of time where either parent could have done anything to their daughter. The investigation expanded outward, rippling through the community like a stone dropped in still water. Every registered sex offender within a 100-mile radius was questioned, their homes searched, their alibis verified or discarded. 3 were arrested on unrelated charges, but none had any connection to Lily. Known child abductors from neighboring states were tracked down and interrogated. Their vehicles were examined, their homes torn apart. Nothing connected any of them to Ashford Hollow or to the Harper family. The FBI was called in, agents in dark suits who took over the case with clinical efficiency. They created profiles, analyzed patterns, cross-referenced databases. They brought in specialists in child abduction, in behavioral analysis, in forensic psychology. They set up wiretaps on the Harper home phone in case a ransom demand came. It never did. As summer faded into autumn, the search continued, but with diminishing intensity. Volunteers grew fewer. News crews packed up their equipment and moved on to newer tragedies. The story of Lily Harper slipped from front-page news to a small paragraph buried in the back of the paper. Margaret stopped sleeping entirely. She couldn't close her eyes without seeing Lily's face, without imagining 1,000 different horrors. Dark circles hollowed beneath her eyes. Her skin took on a grayish pallor. She stopped eating unless David forced her, and even then she could barely choke down more than a few bites. She sat at the window every night, watching the street, waiting. The porch light stayed on, burning through darkness and dawn, a beacon for a child who never came home. David begged her to rest, to eat, to see a doctor. But grief had transformed her into something else, something harder and more desperate. She was no longer the woman who'd hummed while rolling out pie crust. She was a mother without her child, and that absence had carved her hollow. She attended every support group meeting for parents of missing children, driving an hour each way to Pittsburgh every Thursday night. She sat in those circles of grief, listening to other parents share their stories, their pain, their impossible hope. Some have been searching for years, for decades. Their faces haunted her, showed her the future that stretched before her, an endless expanse of not knowing. She called Detective Morrison every week sometimes more. "Any updates?" she'd ask, her voice raw with hope she couldn't quite kill. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harper," he'd reply, and she could hear the weight in his voice, the frustration of a man who wanted answers he couldn't find. "We're still following every lead." But the leads were drying up, running into dead ends, evaporating like morning dew. By the end of the first year, the search was officially suspended. The case remained open, Morrison assured them. It would always remain open. But without new evidence, without new leads, there was nowhere left to look. Lily Harper became a statistic, a name on a long list of unsolved disappearances, a face on a missing poster that yellowed and faded in shop windows until shopkeepers quietly took them down. The town of Ashford Hollow tried to move on, to return to the illusion of safety it had once known. But something had broken that couldn't be fixed. Parents kept their children closer now. Doors that had stayed unlocked were bolted. The easy trust that had defined the community had been replaced by vigilance and fear. Margaret never moved on. She kept every newspaper clipping, every police report, every grainy photocopy of the investigation notes that Morrison would quietly share with her. She filled bankers' boxes with manila folders, each one labeled and dated, "A Museum of Tragedy." She kept Lily's room exactly as it was. The bed made with its pink comforter, the stuffed animals arranged on the pillows, the drawings pinned to the wall with thumbtacks, that childish artwork now precious as gold. She dusted in there every week, vacuumed the floor, changed the sheets even though no one slept in them. And every year on June 17th, she baked a strawberry pie and set a place at the table for a daughter who never came home. The ritual became sacred, a way of saying, "I remember. I'm still waiting. I'll never stop." David dealt with his grief differently. He buried himself in work, taking extra shifts at the mill, volunteering for overtime, staying away from home as much as possible, because being there in that house full of Lily's absence was unbearable. He rarely spoke about it, but Margaret would sometimes catch him standing in the doorway of Lily's room, his face raw with pain, tears streaming silently down his cheeks. In those moments, she'd go to him and they'd hold each other, two people drowning in the same grief, but unable to save each other. Their marriage strained under the weight. Some couples were drawn together by tragedy. Others were torn apart. Margaret and David existed somewhere in between, together but separate, bound by loss, but unable to bridge the distance it created. They stopped going to church, unable to sit in pews and sing hymns about a benevolent God who let children vanish. They stopped seeing friends, tired of the pity in people's eyes, the careful way they spoke, the way conversations would halt when they entered a room. They became ghosts in their own town, recognized but rarely approached, their tragedy a barrier that kept others at a distance. 10 years passed, then 20, then 30. David died on a Sunday morning in October, 5 years before Lily would have turned 36. He'd been reading the newspaper at the kitchen table when his heart simply stopped. The doctor said it was a massive coronary, instantaneous, painless. But Margaret knew better. She believed it was grief that killed him, the accumulated weight of 30 years of missing their daughter, finally crushing something vital inside him. She buried him next to an empty grave, the one they'd purchased decades ago for Lily. Someday, she thought, someday they'll find her, and we'll all be together again. Now, at 62, Margaret lived alone in the same house where she'd raised Lily, where she'd watched her daughter vanish. Her hair had gone completely silver, cut short for practicality. Her hands were gnarled with arthritis that made simple tasks painful. Her back ached constantly, a permanent stoop from years of looking down, always searching faces in crowds for the one that would never appear. She still thought of Lily every single day, still saw her in flashes, a girl with red hair crossing a street, a laugh that sounded familiar in a grocery store. Still woke sometimes in the night, certain she'd heard her daughter calling for her. The house was quiet now in a way that felt permanent. No television, because the noise seemed disrespectful to the silence. No visitors, because she'd outlived or alienated almost everyone she'd once known. Just Margaret and her memories and the boxes of evidence that filled the spare bedroom. On the evening of June 17th, 2011, Margaret sat in the living room as the sun set beyond the windows, painting the walls gold and crimson. She'd stopped baking pies years ago. The ritual had become too painful, a monument to everything she'd lost. Instead, she found herself thinking about the attic. She hadn't been up there in at least 5 years, not since she'd gone looking for David's old winter coat to donate. But tonight, on what would have been Lily's 36th birthday, she felt pulled toward it. Slowly, painfully, she climbed the narrow stairs, each step a negotiation with knees that protested movement. The attic was stifling despite the evening cool, decades of accumulated heat trapped beneath the slanted roof. Dust swirled in the amber light filtering through the small window, creating galaxies in the stale air. Boxes lined the walls, decades of memories packed away in cardboard and hope. Christmas decorations she'd never use again. David's clothes that she couldn't bring herself to donate. Her mother's china, carefully wrapped in newspaper from 1995. And in the far corner, she found what she was looking for. A large box, bigger than the others, its sides bulging slightly. Written on the side in her own handwriting, faded but still legible, Lily, 1975 to 1981. Margaret stood there for a long moment, gathering strength. Then she bent, ignoring the protest from her back, and lifted the box. It was heavier than she remembered, or perhaps she was just weaker now. She carried it downstairs slowly, pausing on each step to rest, and set it on the kitchen table. The same table where she'd once helped Lily with coloring books, where they'd eaten breakfast together every morning, where David had sat when his heart finally gave up. She made herself a cup of tea first, delaying the inevitable pain. Let steep too long, so it tasted bitter. Sat down with shaking hands and finally, carefully, lifted the lid. The smell hit her first. Old fabric, yellowed paper, the indefinable scent of time passing. Inside were the artifacts of a life cut short. A pair of tiny red sneakers, the ones Lily had worn until the toes burst through. A favorite dress, yellow with daisies, carefully folded and wrapped in tissue paper. Margaret lifted it out, held it to her face, breathed in deep. After 30 years, it smelled only of storage, but she remembered the scent of her daughter, strawberry shampoo, and chalk dust in childhood. There were drawings, dozens of them, carefully preserved in clear, protective sleeves. Crayon masterpieces of families holding hands, houses with too many windows, flowers with faces. Each one signed in blocky letters, Lily. Report cards from kindergarten and first grade, full of teachers' comments. Lily is a joy to have in class. Such a creative spirit, always ready to help others. A stuffed elephant, its gray fabric worn soft from being loved, one ear hanging by a thread. Margaret remembered sewing that ear back on at least a dozen times. Lily had taken that elephant everywhere, had slept with it every night, had given it a name Margaret couldn't quite remember now. Was it Edgar? Edmund? The fact that she'd forgotten felt like a betrayal. A lock of hair, copper red and silky, tied with a ribbon in a small plastic bag. Margaret had cut it when Lily was 3, wanting to preserve that color, that texture, some physical piece of her daughter. And beneath it all, wrapped in a faded pillowcase, were the photo albums. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted them out. There were 3 albums, chronicling Lily's short life from birth to that last morning. She'd looked through these albums hundreds of times over the years, thousands of times maybe. Every photograph was seared into her memory. She could have described each one from memory alone, or so she'd thought. She opened the first album, the pages crackling slightly. Lily as a newborn, impossibly tiny, wrapped in the pink blanket Margaret's mother had knitted. Her face was red and scrunched, her eyes closed, one tiny fist raised beside her head. The next pages showed her growing. 3 months old, finally smiling. 6 months, sitting up with support. 9 months, crawling across the living room floor, David's hand visible in the frame, ready to catch her if she fell. Her first birthday, face covered in cake, chocolate everywhere, her eyes wide with delight. Her second birthday, opening presents with focused concentration. Her third, fourth, fifth, each one a marker of time passing, of a life being lived. And then, the final pages. Margaret turned to them slowly, even though she knew what she'd find. The last photographs ever taken of Lily Harper on the morning of June 17, 1981. There were 5 photos from that morning. Margaret remembered taking them, remembered asking Lily to pose in her new sundress, the one she'd stayed up late the night before finishing. In the first photo, Lily stood on the front porch, holding the railing, looking back over her shoulder at the camera. The morning sun caught her hair, turning it to flame. In the second, she was mid-jump off the bottom step, her face lit with laughter, her dress billowing around her. In the third, she was crouched on the sidewalk, examining something in the grass. A ladybug, Margaret remembered. She'd been fascinated by the bright red shell, the tiny black spots. In the fourth, she was standing with her arms spread wide, pretending to be a bird about to take flight. And in the fifth, the last one, she was looking directly at the camera. Not smiling, not performing. Just looking, her expression serious and solemn in the way children sometimes got when they were thinking deep thoughts. Margaret had studied these photos until she'd memorized every pixel. The exact angle of sunlight. The flowers blooming in Mrs. Brennan's garden, just visible in the background. The way Lily's hair had fallen across her shoulder. The small smudge of dirt on her knee from where she'd knelt. She knew these photographs. Knew them intimately. Completely. But tonight, as she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp casting harsh shadows across the glossy surface, she saw something she'd never seen before. It started as just a feeling, an itch in the back of her mind that something was wrong. She stared at the fifth photograph, the one of Lily looking at the camera, and felt her heartbeat quicken. There was something in the background, something she'd looked at 1,000 times, but had never truly registered. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum. She moved to the counter where she kept her reading glasses, put them on with shaking hands, and returned to the photo. She held it closer, squinting at the background behind Lily's shoulder. There, on the far left edge of the frame, partially obscured by Mrs. Brennan's oak tree, was a vehicle, a white van. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She lifted the photo closer to her face, trying to make out details in the grainy image. The van was parked on the street, maybe 4 houses down. It wasn't in focus, just a blur of white in the background. In 30 years, she'd never noticed it. Never had any reason to. It was just part of the scenery, meaningless background detail. But now she saw it. And more than that, she recognized it. The van had a distinctive curved roof, higher in the back than in the front. And on the side, just barely visible, was a small square window. Margaret's mind raced backward through decades, through memories she'd filed away as irrelevant. White van, curved roof, side window, and then it clicked. Thomas Pritchard. The name exploded in her mind like a bomb, scattering memories in all directions. Thomas Pritchard, the music teacher at Riverside Elementary. The one who'd taught Lily to play Mary Had a Little Lamb on the recorder. The one who'd organized the spring concert where Lily had dressed as a daisy and sung about sunshine. The one who drove a white van with a curved roof and a side window because he needed the space to transport instruments and equipment for the school music program. The one who'd helped search for Lily the day she disappeared, his face drawn with concern, his eyes red as if he'd been crying. The one who'd spoken at the vigil, his voice breaking as he talked about what a special little girl Lily had been, how her absence left a hole in all their hearts. The one who'd left Ashford Hollow exactly 10 days after Lily vanished. Margaret's hands began to shake so violently she nearly dropped the photograph. How had she never made this connection before? How had no one made this connection? She tried to think back to that day, to reconstruct the timeline. Thomas had been at the school that morning, she thought. Or had he? School was out for summer. Why would he have been there? And more importantly, why would his van have been parked on Riverside Street that morning? He lived on the other side of town, at least 4 miles away. There was no reason for him to be in their neighborhood. No music lessons scheduled, no school business. Summer vacation had just started. Margaret grabbed her phone from the counter, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. She still had Detective Morrison's number programmed in, even though she hadn't called in over 2 years. The phone rang 4 times, then 5. She was about to give up when a familiar voice answered, rough with sleep or maybe whiskey. "Morrison, it's Margaret Harper," she said, her voice shaking. "I need you to come to my house. Right now. Please." There was a pause, then a sigh. "Mrs. Harper, it's almost 10 o'clock at night. Can this wait until morning?" "No," she said firmly. "It can't. I found something in one of the photos from that day. Something that shouldn't be there." She could hear Morrison sitting up, rustling sounds in the background. When he spoke again, his voice was alert. "What did you find?" "Thomas Pritchard's van," Margaret said, in the background of a photo taken that morning. "He was on our street, right before Lily disappeared." Another pause, longer this time. "You're sure it's his van?" "Positive," Margaret said. "I'd know it anywhere. That distinctive shape, the window. Everyone knew that van. Frank, he was there. He was right there." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Morrison said. "Don't touch anything else. Don't call anyone else. Just wait for me." Margaret hung up and sank back in her chair, the photograph still clutched in her trembling hands. Her mind was racing, pulling up memories she hadn't examined in years. Thomas Pritchard had been young when he taught at Riverside Elementary, maybe 30 years old. Handsome in an unassuming way, with sandy brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He played guitar, she remembered, had performed at the school talent show. The children had loved him. Parents had trusted him. Margaret had trusted him. She'd sent Lily to music class twice a week, never questioning, never worrying. Why would she? He was a teacher. Teachers were safe. She thought about the day Lily disappeared, about the search that had followed. Thomas had been there, helping look through the woods, calling Lily's name until his voice went hoarse. She remembered him talking to the police, giving a statement. What had he told them? Had they even asked where he'd been that morning? And then he'd left town, just packed up and moved away. There'd been a small gathering at the school, she recalled. A farewell party in the music room. He'd told everyone he'd accepted a position in Oregon, a better opportunity, better pay. Everyone had understood. Ashford Hollow was a small town. Ambitious people left. But had he really gone to Oregon? Had anyone verified that? Margaret's chest felt tight. 30 years. 30 years she'd been searching for answers. And they might have been right there, hidden in plain sight. The knock on the door came exactly 18 minutes later. Margaret jumped despite expecting it. Her nerves wound so tight she felt like she might snap. Detective Frank Morrison stood on her porch, no longer the young officer who'd first responded to her call in 1981. He was 63 now, his hair completely gray, deep lines carved into his face. He'd stayed with the case all these years, even when others had moved on, even when the trail went cold. It had haunted him the way it haunted her. "Show me," he said without preamble, stepping inside. Margaret led him to the kitchen table where the photo album lay open. She pointed to the 5th photograph with a trembling finger. "There, in the background. That's Thomas Pritchard's van." Morrison pulled reading glasses from his shirt pocket and bent over the photograph, studying it intently. His jaw clenched. "You're certain?" "Absolutely," Margaret said. "Look at the shape, the curve of the roof. And that window on the side. Everyone in town knew that van. The kids called it the Music Mobile." Morrison straightened slowly. "Do you have a magnifying glass?" Margaret retrieved one from the junk drawer, handed it over. Morrison bent over the photo again, this time with the magnifying glass pressed close. He was silent for a long time, studying every detail. Finally, he straightened. His face had gone pale. "Mrs. Harper, do you remember Thomas Pritchard being questioned during the investigation?" Margaret thought back, trying to recall. "I assume everyone at the school was questioned. He helped with the search, but I don't remember specifically." Morrison pulled out his phone, made a call. "This is Morrison. I need you to pull the Harper case files." "All of them?" "Yes, I know what time it is. This is priority 1. I'll be at the station in 30 minutes. He hung up and looked at Margaret. "I'm going to take this photograph with me. I'll get it to our lab, have them enhance the image, see if we can pull any more details. License plate, maybe a clear view of the driver." "There's someone in it?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking. "In the van. Can't tell for sure," Morrison said. "But there's a shadow behind the windshield. Could be a person, could be nothing, but we'll find out." He carefully removed the photograph from the album, slipping it into an evidence bag he'd pulled from his jacket pocket. "I'm also going to pull every file we have on Thomas Pritchard. Interview notes, background checks, everything. And I'm going to make some calls, find out where he ended up." "Oregon," Margaret said. "He said he was going to Oregon to teach." Morrison's expression darkened. "We'll verify that. If he lied about where he was going, that's significant." Margaret felt dizzy, overwhelmed. "How do we miss this? How did I look at that photo 1,000 times and never see it?" "Sometimes we see what we expect to see," Morrison said gently. "And sometimes it takes time for details to reveal themselves. The important thing is you saw it now." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Mrs. Harper, I need you to prepare yourself. Even if Pritchard's van was on your street that morning, it doesn't necessarily mean he was involved. He could have had a legitimate reason to be there. At 7:30 in the morning?" Margaret challenged. "On a Saturday? In our neighborhood, when he lived across town?" Morrison said nothing, which was answer enough. After he left, Margaret couldn't bring herself to go to bed. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space where the photograph had been, her mind churning through possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider before. Thomas Pritchard, kind, gentle Thomas who sang folk songs and taught children to love music, who'd seemed genuinely devastated by Lily's disappearance, who'd hugged Margaret at the vigil and told her he was praying for Lily's safe return. Had it all been an act? Had he been hiding in plain sight, pretending to grieve while knowing exactly where Lily was? The thought made Margaret physically ill. She ran to the bathroom and vomited, her whole body shaking with revulsion and rage. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret was still sitting at the table, wide awake, waiting for Morrison to call. The call came at 8:15. "Mrs. Harper, I need you to come down to the station," Morrison said, his voice tight. "We've got some information, and I'd rather discuss it in person." "Tell me now," Margaret demanded. "I can't wait. Please." Morrison sighed. Thomas Pritchard never worked at any school in Oregon. In fact, there's no record of him teaching anywhere after he left Pennsylvania. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "What?" "His teaching license was surrendered in June of 1982, 1 year after he left Ashford Hollow. No reason given. No disciplinó de acción. He just stopped teaching." "Where did he go?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. "That's what we're trying to figure out," Morrison said. "He moved around a lot. Montana, Idaho, Nevada. Never stayed in one place more than a few years. We're tracking down addresses, talking to local authorities in each location." And Margaret pressed. Morrison hesitated. "And in 2 of those locations, there were reports of missing children. Nothing conclusive, but the timing is suspicious." Margaret felt the room spin. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "You think he took other children?" "I think it's a possibility we need to investigate," Morrison said carefully. "Mrs. Harper, I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to come to the station. We need to go through everything you remember about Thomas Pritchard. Every interaction, every detail, no matter how small." "I'm coming now," Margaret said, already reaching for her purse. The police station was the same building where she'd given her first statement 30 years ago, though it had been renovated since then. New paint, new furniture, but the same fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick and exhausted. Morrison met her in the lobby, led her to a small conference room. Inside, the table was covered with files, photographs, maps. Two other detectives she didn't recognize were already there, their faces grave. "Mrs. Harper, this is Detective Sarah Chun and Detective Michael Rodriguez," Morrison said. "They're assisting with the investigation." Margaret nodded, barely registering their names. Her eyes were fixed on the photographs spread across the table. Some she recognized, blown-up versions of pictures from Lily's case file. Others were new, surveillance photos, property records, images she didn't understand. "We've been working through the night," Chin said. She was younger than Morrison, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and an efficient manner. "We've tracked Thomas Pritchard's movements over the past 30 years. And Mrs. Harper, what we've found is disturbing." She pulled out a map of the western United States, red pins marking various locations. After leaving Pennsylvania in 1981, Pritchard moved to Montana. He purchased a property there with cash, about 40 acres of isolated land. County records listed as a youth camp, but there's no official registration, no licensing, no oversight. Margaret stared at the map, her mouth dry. "A youth camp. That's what he called it," Rodriguez added. He was older, heavy-set, with a face that looked like it had seen too much. He advertised it as a place for troubled children, runaways, kids who needed structure. Claimed he was helping them get their lives together. Was he licensed to do that? Margaret asked. "No," Morrison said flatly. "No licenses, no inspections, no background checks. He operated completely under the radar." Chin pulled out another set of photographs. In 1987, 2 children went missing from a town about 50 miles from Pritchard's property. A brother and sister, ages 8 and 10. They were last seen walking home from school. Never found. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "You think he took them?" "We don't know," Chin admitted, "but the timing is suspicious." And then in 1993, Pritchard suddenly sold the Montana property and moved to Idaho. Purchased another large piece of land, again called it a youth facility. "And in Idaho?" Margaret asked, though she was afraid of the answer. 3 missing children over a 6-year period, Rodriguez said quietly. All from surrounding towns. All between the ages of 6 and 12. All vanished without a trace. The room tilted. Margaret gripped the edge of the table, trying to breathe. "Oh God! Oh my God!" Morrison crouched beside her chair, his hand on her shoulder. "Mrs. Harper, I know this is hard to hear, but we need you to focus. We need everything you can remember about Thomas Pritchard. Did he ever spend time alone with Lily? Did he ever visit your home? Did you ever see him outside of school?" Margaret forced herself to think, to push through the horror and access memories she'd filed away as unimportant. "He came to our house once, about a month before Lily disappeared. He said he wanted to discuss Lily's progress in music class, that she showed real talent." "Who else was there?" Chin asked, taking notes. "Just me and Lily. David was at work. Thomas stayed for maybe 20 minutes. We sat at the kitchen table, drank lemonade. He told me Lily had a gift for music, that I should consider private lessons." "Did you?" Morrison asked. "No," Margaret said. "We couldn't afford it. But he said he'd give her free lessons after school, just for the joy of teaching someone so talented." The detectives exchanged glances. "Did those lessons happen?" Rodriguez asked. Margaret thought hard. "I don't think so. School was going to end for summer just a few weeks later, and then Lily was gone." "Did Thomas ever seem inappropriate with Lily?" Chin asked gently. "Anything that made you uncomfortable?" "No," Margaret said, then paused. "Actually, there was one thing. At the spring concert, I saw him fixing Lily's costume. He was crouched down, adjusting the flower petals on her dress. His hands were on her shoulders, and Lily looked uncomfortable. When she saw me watching, she ran over and held my hand for the rest of the evening." "Did you ask her about it?" Morrison prompted. "I did," Margaret said, the memory coming back now. She said Mr. Pritchard's hands were cold, and it made her shivery. I just thought she meant literally cold, like his hands were chilly. But now, her voice broke. Now I wonder if she meant something else. She made detailed notes. Did you ever see Thomas Pritchard's van before that morning? Sure, Margaret said. He parked it at the school, and sometimes I'd see it around town. At the grocery store, the bank. It wasn't unusual. But you never saw it on your street before? Rodriguez asked. Margaret shook her head. Never. We lived in a residential neighborhood. There was no reason for him to be there. Morrison stood, moved to the table, and picked up a file. Mrs. Harper, we've been working with the FBI. They're analyzing the enhanced image of the photograph. We should have results within a few hours. If we can get a clear shot of the license plate or the driver, we'll have concrete evidence. And then what? Margaret asked. You find him and arrest him? If we can prove he was on your street that morning, and if we can connect him to Lily's disappearance, yes, Morrison said. But I need to be honest with you. It's been 30 years. Physical evidence is gone. Witnesses are dead or their memories have faded. This won't be easy. But it's something, Margaret said, her voice breaking. After 30 years of nothing, it's finally something. Morrison's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then his eyes widened. The lab. They got the enhanced image. He pulled up the email on the computer in the corner of the room, and the four of them crowded around the screen. The image loaded slowly, one line of pixels at a time. When it finally appeared, Margaret's breath caught. The enhancement was remarkable. The van was now crystal clear, every detail visible. The curved roof, the side window, and painted on the back doors, just visible in the angle of the shot, were musical notes. Eighth notes and quarter notes dancing across the white panel. That's his van, Margaret whispered. That's definitely his van. Chun pointed to the windshield. Look there. Is that a person? The shadow behind the windshield was clearer now, definitely human-shaped. A figure sitting in the driver's seat, facing forward, hands on the wheel. And on the driver's side door, partially visible, was something else. A license plate number. Rodriguez leaned closer, squinting. Can you enhance that section more? Morrison worked the controls, zooming in on the license plate. The image pixelated, then resolved. 6 characters, clear as day. Run it, Chun said immediately. Morrison already had another window open, accessing the Pennsylvania DMV database. His fingers flew across the keyboard, entering the plate number. The results came back instantly. Registered owner, Thomas William Pritchard. Vehicle, 1978 Dodge B-Series van, white. Registration address, for 27 Maple Grove Road, Ashford Hollow, Pennsylvania. We've got him, Morrison said softly. We've got the bastard. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, though she wasn't sure if they were tears of relief or anguish. What happens now? Now we find him, Chun said, her voice hard. And we make sure he answers for what he's done. Over the next 48 hours, the investigation exploded into a multi-state manhunt. The FBI got involved officially, coordinating with local authorities across the western United States. Pritchard's properties were identified, surveilled, and ultimately raided. The Montana property had been sold to new owners 15 years ago, but forensic teams combed through it anyway, looking for evidence. They found disturbing signs, modified rooms with locks on the outside, windows that had been painted over, crawl spaces that looked like they'd been used for confinement. But no remains, no definitive proof. The Idaho property told a similar story. New owners, but evidence of modifications. Hidden rooms, reinforced doors. The new owners had found it strange, but hadn't thought to report it. We just figured the previous owner was paranoid, they told investigators. Pritchard's current location was harder to pin down. He'd sold the Idaho property in 2007 and seemingly vanished. No property purchases under his name. No employment records. No tax filings. But the FBI had resources. They tracked credit cards, phone records, utility bills. Cross-reference data from a dozen different databases. And finally, they found him. He was living in a remote area of rural Oregon, ironically close to where he'd originally claimed to be moving in 1981. He'd been using the name William Morrison, a cruel twist that made Detective Morrison's blood boil. He owned a 50-acre property registered under a shell corporation. County records listed it as a therapeutic wilderness program for at-risk youth. "We've seen this before," the FBI agent told Margaret over the phone. "People like Pritchard, they find ways to continue their patterns. They create legitimate-looking organizations that give them access to vulnerable children." "Is Lily there?" Margaret asked, her voice shaking. "Could she be there?" "We're preparing a raid now," the agent said. "We'll know soon." Margaret insisted on being there. Morrison tried to talk her out of it, but she was immovable. "If my daughter is in that place, I need to be there when she comes out. I need to be the first face she sees." They compromised. Margaret could come, but she'd have to stay back, away from the immediate action. Morrison would accompany her, keep her safe and informed. The flight to Oregon felt endless. Margaret couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything except the possibility that it consumed her every thought for 30 years. What if Lily was there? What if she was alive? The alternative, that Pritchard had killed her, that she'd been dead all these years, was too horrible to contemplate. Margaret had lived on hope for 3 decades. She couldn't abandon it now. They landed in Portland and drove 3 hours into the mountains, following a caravan of federal vehicles. FBI, local police, forensic teams, ambulances on standby. The property was accessed via a long gravel road that wound through dense forest. At the entrance, a wooden sign read, "New Horizons Youth Center, building better futures." Margaret felt sick looking at it. How many parents had been deceived by that wholesome facade? How many children had disappeared behind that cheerful sign? The vehicles stopped half a mile from the main buildings. Law enforcement geared up, strapping on body armor, checking weapons. They'd obtained a warrant, but no one knew what they'd find. Pritchard could be dangerous. There could be weapons. There might be children who'd been so indoctrinated they'd defend him. Margaret waited in a van with Morrison, watching through binoculars as the teams moved in. "Breathe," Morrison reminded her gently. "Whatever happens, just breathe." She tried. Failed. Her whole body was shaking. Through the binoculars, she watched agents surround the main house. Saw them breach the door. Heard, even at this distance, the shouted commands. "FBI, on the ground. Hands where we can see them." Minutes ticked by like hours. Then Morrison's radio crackled. "Suspect in custody." "Repeat, Thomas Pritchard is in custody." Margaret's hands flew to her mouth. "Multiple juveniles on site," the voice continued, "requesting medical teams and social services. We need immediate assistance." Morrison turned to Margaret. "They found children. They're bringing them out now." Margaret couldn't wait anymore. She threw open the van door and started running toward the property, ignoring Morrison's shouts behind her. She had to know, had to see. She reached the main house just as they were bringing people out. Children, teenagers, young adults, all looking confused, frightened, blinking in the sunlight like they hadn't seen it in years. Margaret scanned every face desperately, searching for copper-red hair, for eyes she'd know anywhere. A girl, maybe 10, with dark hair and haunted eyes. A boy, early teens, thin and scared. Another girl, maybe 16, crying. A young man, early 20s, looking around wildly. And then, emerging from the house with an FBI agent's hand on her elbow, a young woman. She was thin, maybe too thin, with auburn hair pulled back in a braid. She wore jeans and an oversized sweater despite the warmth of the day. Her face was pale, uncertain, and when she looked up, Margaret's world stopped. The eyes, green with flecks of gold, just like Margaret remembered. The same spattering of freckles across the nose, faded now, but still there. The same shape of the face, the same curve of the chin. Older, so much older, but unmistakably, impossibly, miraculously familiar. "Lily," Margaret whispered, the name barely escaping her lips. The young woman froze, looked directly at Margaret, Their eyes met across 30 years of absence, of grief, of loss. Something flickered in the young woman's expression. Confusion, then recognition, then something Margaret couldn't quite name. Margaret started forward, moving without conscious thought. Morrison tried to stop her, but she shook him off. "Lily," she said again, louder now, tears streaming down her face. "Lily, baby, it's me. It's Mom." The young woman stared at her, blinked. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. And then, in a voice rough from disuse, damaged by years of silence, she spoke. "Mom." The word broke something in Margaret's chest. She covered the remaining distance and pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her the way she'd dreamed of holding her for 10,950 days. Lily stood rigid in the embrace, her body tense, uncertain. Then slowly, so slowly, her arms came up, wrapped around Margaret's back, held on, and she began to cry. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. 30 years of pain pouring out in broken sounds that had no words. Margaret held her daughter and cried with her, mourning the lost years, the stolen childhood, the life that should have been. Around them, chaos continued. Other children being led to ambulances. Forensic teams photographing everything. Thomas Pritchard being loaded into a patrol car, his face emotionless, offering no resistance. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Margaret had her daughter back. The reunion was joyful and agonizing in equal measure. In the days that followed, as the investigation unfolded and the full scope of Thomas Pritchard's crimes came to light, Margaret learned the truth about what had happened to her daughter. Pritchard had taken Lily that morning exactly as they'd suspected. He'd lured her to his van with the promise of showing her something special, a music box that played her favorite song. The moment she climbed inside, he'd driven away. He'd kept her hidden for 3 days in a storage unit on the outskirts of town, telling her that her parents had been in an accident and he was keeping her safe. Lily, only 6 years old and terrified, had believed him. Then he'd driven her to Montana, dyeing her hair dark brown and giving her a new name. By the time they arrived at his property, Lily wasn't Lily anymore. She was Autumn, and her parents weren't missing her. They were dead, killed in the accident, and Thomas was her guardian now. He'd been careful, methodical, never physically abusive in ways that would leave visible scars. But his control had been absolute. He'd homeschooled her, kept her isolated from other children, monitored her every moment. When she'd ask questions about her past, he told her she was remembering wrong, that she'd hit her head in the accident and her memories were confused. By the time she was 10, Lily had stopped asking questions. By 15, she'd almost believed the story he'd told her. By 20, she'd forgotten there was ever a time when she'd been someone else. Now, at 36, she was trying to piece together 2 incompatible lives. The child who'd drawn chalk flowers on a sidewalk in Pennsylvania, and the young woman who'd spent 30 years being someone else. "I remember things," she told Margaret one afternoon as they sat in a quiet room at the hospital where she was being evaluated. "Little flashes, a yellow dress, strawberries, your voice singing. But I don't know if they're real memories or if I'm imagining them because I want them to be real." "They're real," Margaret assured her, taking her hand gently. "All of it is real, sweetheart. You're Lily Harper. You're my daughter. And you're home now." But home was a complicated concept. Lily had never lived in Margaret's house, had no memory of David, who died before she was found, had no connection to Ashford Hollow or the life she'd once lived. She had friends from Pritchard's compound, the other captives who'd become her family. She had routines, coping mechanisms, an entire life built in captivity. Freedom was terrifying. The trial was scheduled for the following year. Thomas Pritchard faced charges in multiple states, counts of kidnapping, false imprisonment, child abuse, and identity fraud. The list grew as investigators uncovered more victims, more missing children who'd ended up in his care. Lily would have to testify. So would Margaret. So would a dozen other survivors. It would be painful, re-traumatizing, but necessary. I want to do it, Lily told Margaret. I want to look him in the eye and tell the world what he did. Not just to me, but to all of us. Margaret squeezed her hand. I'll be right there with you. Every step. The day of the trial, the courthouse was packed. Media from around the country had descended, cameras everywhere, reporters shouting questions. Margaret held Lily's hand as they walked up the courthouse steps, shielding her from the worst of it. Inside, they took their seats in the gallery. Thomas Pritchard sat at the defense table, looking older than Margaret remembered. His hair had gone completely gray. Deep lines carved his face, but his eyes were the same, calm and cold and utterly empty of remorse. When Lily took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke clearly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. She described the morning she was taken, the van, the storage unit, the drive to Montana, the years that followed. She didn't cry, didn't break down, just told the truth in simple, devastating detail. When she finished, she looked directly at Thomas Pritchard. You stole my childhood, she said. You stole my family, my identity, my life. But you didn't break me. I survived you. And now everyone knows what you really are. Pritchard said nothing, just stared back at her with those empty eyes. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Witness after witness testified. Forensic evidence was presented. Documents, photographs, recordings. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Thomas Pritchard was sentenced to multiple life terms without possibility of parole. He'd die in prison, and Margaret felt nothing but satisfaction at the thought. In the months that followed, Lily slowly began to rebuild her life. She started therapy, working through the trauma with a specialist in long-term captivity cases. She reconnected with her identity, learning about the parents who'd never stopped searching for her. Margaret showed her photo albums, told her stories about David, about the neighborhood, about the life she'd had before it was stolen. Some memories returned. Others stayed locked away. But gradually, painfully, Lily began to remember who she'd been. She moved in with Margaret, sleeping in her childhood room that had been preserved like a shrine for 30 years. At first, it felt strange, like living in a museum of someone else's life. But slowly, it began to feel familiar. She found work at a bookstore, made friends, started building a life that was truly hers. Not the life Thomas had forced on her, but one she chose for herself. And one afternoon in June, 5 years after she'd been found, Margaret baked a strawberry pie. When it came out of the oven, golden and perfect, she set the table for two. Lily came into the kitchen, drawn by the smell. Is that what I think it is? Your favorite, Margaret said, cutting 2 generous slices. Or at least it used to be. I don't know if you still like strawberries. Lily sat down at the table, accepting the plate Margaret offered. She took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. Then she smiled. A real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. I still like them, she said. I'd forgotten, but I still like them. They ate together in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after surviving the unsurvivable. I dream about him sometimes, Lily admitted quietly. About being back there. About the van. About that storage unit. I know, Margaret said. I dream about the empty sidewalk. About the moment I looked up and you were gone. Lily reached across the table and took her mother's hand. But I'm here now. We're here. Margaret squeezed back, tears in her eyes. Yes, we are. It wasn't the life either of them had imagined. It wasn't closure, wasn't neat or simple or without scars. The years they'd lost could never be recovered. The trauma could never be completely erased. But it was real. And after 30 years of absence, real was everything. Some stories don't end the way we expect. Some disappearances don't end in tragedy. And sometimes, the smallest detail in an old photograph can change everything, can shatter a world built on lies, and bring someone home. Margaret Harper never stopped believing, never stopped searching, never accepted the silence. She looked at photographs she'd seen 1,000 times and finally saw what had been there all along. And because of that, her daughter came home. If this story moved you the way it moved us, we need you to do something. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because we bring you these incredible true crime stories every single week. Turn on that notification bell so you never miss when we upload. And share this video. Share Lily and Margaret's story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who loves true crime, someone who believes in the power of a mother's love that never gives up. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think. Have you ever noticed something in an old photo that changed everything? Do you have a story you think we should cover? We read every single comment, and your stories matter to us. Remember, if you or someone you know has information about a missing person, never give up. Never stop looking. Never stop asking questions. Because sometimes, against all odds, people do come home. Sometimes the truth does surface. Sometimes justice, however delayed, does arrive. The truth is out there, sometimes hidden in plain sight for decades, buried in the corner of an old photograph, waiting for someone who refuses to give up to finally see it. Lily Harper was missing for 30 years. 30 years of silence, of grief, of absence. But her mother never stopped looking. And in the end, that made all the difference. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop searching for the truth. Because every missing person deserves to be found. Every family deserves answers. And every truth, no matter how long it's been hidden, deserves to be brought into the light. This is the kind of story that reminds us why we do what we do, why we dig into these cases, why we share these stories, why we believe that awareness and persistence can change lives. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for helping us spread the word that hope is never truly lost. See you in the next video.